I'd like to welcome everyone here in our live studio audience to today's event. And for those on the World Wide Web, because we're live streaming today, welcome to you as well. So I'd like to talk about the call to action number 43 of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee states. We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. So when you Google the United Nations, the line beside the title is Peace, Dignity, and Equality on a Healthy Planet. And as we thank the ancestral guardians of this land, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Attawandarong, we need to reflect and act upon how we can do better to fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's calls to action, and how each of us can work harder for peace, dignity, and equality for generations to come. So a few housekeeping things before we get to the superstars today. So we'll have time for your questions. Just our ushers are circulating with note cards. Write your questions down, clear, concise, not too much extra stuff, and we'll get them up to our moderator as soon as we can. For those who are joining us from home today, we'd love to hear from you. So just write your question in the chat, and we will get that up to our moderator as well. So now to the good part. So we've been looking forward to this event for a long time, and I'm thrilled to be introducing your host today. Author, lecturer, mental health advocate, and the senior medical advisor of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. A man who has his own Wikipedia page, and now his own recurring series here at the Meighen Forum. A most generous and kind person, the witty, the unstoppable. In fact, he's practically a member of the Avengers. Dr. David Goldbloom.
Come on up, Bob. This is going to be a lot better with you here. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this series, which was on hiatus until we got renewed by the festival as the pandemic moved on. As you heard, my name is David Goldbloom, and I'm delighted to be kicking off the 2022 season of these interviews with Bob Rae. And for those of you who have attended this forum recurring event in the past, you will know that the gimmick of the event is that I only interview people I've known for a long time. And that's really designed to offset the fact that I'm not a real interviewer. I just play one on television. And so the other tradition in this series is the unearthing of old photos to prove the personal connection. So
none of which I've seen.
Yeah, this is all going to be a surprise to Bob. But I first met Bob in 1993, and it was at the North American Rhodes Scholars reunion in Washington, and we were having a very pleasant conversation when the most distinguished alumnus, President Bill Clinton, entered the gathering. Bob stopped me in mid-sentence. He actually pushed me over in order to get into a photo op with President Clinton. I have the picture of that gathering. If you could put up the first slide. Now, fortunately, it was just a sprain, and I was off crutches in a couple of weeks. But you see Bob and me here with Alan Blakeney of Bridgewater and Saskatchewan, as well as John Coleman of Montreal. And as you can tell from the photo, we've both sustained our youth hair color and body weight. And by way of opening disclaimer, I also need to acknowledge the multi-generation connection between my family and Bob. My parents, my late parents, knew and revered Bob. My cousin Jonathan Goldbloom, who was a member of the board of the festival, was his campaign manager for the federal Liberal leadership, and my son Daniel worked in that campaign. So with that aside, this will be a no-holds-barred takedown interview. Now, I have to say, several years ago, people thought they had seen the end of Bob Rae on national television, as per the next slide. Thank you. But this was actually simply a demonstration of Rick Mercer and Bob Rae showing how to make ends meet. The image probably evokes for you the Canadian toonie, you know, with a picture of the Queen on the front and a bear behind. Now, Bob currently serves as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, and his long political career includes serving as a federal and provincial member of Parliament for the NDP and the Liberal parties, as a provincial NDP MPP, as well as, of course, the premier of our province from 1990 to 1995. And I want to point out to you that Bob has, in fact, won 10 more elections than Donald Trump. or 9, depending on who's counting. Right? Now, if you were to imagine Canadian and international issues as a kind of Where's Waldo book, you would be able to find Bob in many of those pictures. If I could have the next slide. Whether it is restructuring the Canadian Red Cross or investigating the Air India disaster, mediating the softwood lumber dispute, reviewing higher education in Ontario, addressing issues of federal governance around the world, and asking what can be done to help the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, and many other issues. Bob has been there. And at the same time, he has an abiding passion for the arts, has played an important leadership role at the Toronto Symphony and at the Royal Conservatory of Music, all of them in the desperate hope of being asked to play the piano and sing. So here we are in Stratford's newest jewel, and how wonderful is it to be gathered this season at the Tom Patterson. Bob, I know you've been coming to Stratford. You were probably here for opening season in '53, but you've been here as a speaker and as an audience member. Your wife, Arlene, served ably on the board of the festival. And I actually remember when we had a forum event several years ago honoring Wayne and Schuster. And the cast of Julius Caesar that season put on a concert version of Rinse the Blood Off My Toga, the classic sketch. And I remember looking up and seeing Bob helpless with laughter and actually crying. He was laughing so hard. It was a great moment. So I'm actually now going to get into the questions because we're almost out of time.
I was going to say, I've really enjoyed being here.
Yeah. That's the problem with Bob. Yak, yak. You know, you can never get a word in. Bob, can you talk about, first of all, your earliest experiences of coming to Stratford and what the festival means for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, David, it's great to be with you. And we had dinner last night, and I told him I was terrified of this experience for two reasons. David's a very good friend, but he's also a scary interviewer, and he's a psychiatrist, so you feel vulnerable in front of him. So,
and how does that feel?
Well, exactly. Well, yeah, I get that. That's the journalist question today. So how did you feel when you heard that something? Stratford has been a part of my life since the '60s. As you know, I lived quite a lot of my early life out of the country and missed the opening. I think I was attending the funeral of King George the Sixth or something. I can't remember.
And you dodged the Boer War.
Yeah, that was a Boer dodger then. So I came as a student. I was at U of T in the 60s and came here to watch, to see plays, and totally overwhelmed by the quality of the performances and everything about it. Came back again in the 70s when I came back from Oxford and started dating my wife. We came here very early on. Arlene is a graduate of U of T's Drama Center and has been on the board here, so we've really enjoyed it. Come back many, many times. I politically came back here to bring people to see that the festival was about the whole of the activities of the city. And we did a culture day in Stratford, which was really a lot of fun. Made many, many close friendships with actors. Peter Donaldson was a very close friend of mine, and Cynthia Dale, of course. And we spent a lot of time just coming here and visiting, and really love the city. And every year that we come, and we'd missed COVID like everybody else, but coming back here has been wonderful this last weekend to see the shows that we've seen, and we missed the ending of Richard III because of the fire alarm last night. But
apparently you can yell fire in a crowded theater.
Well, you can, and also his last speech was a fire extinguisher, my kingdom for a fire extinguisher, which was I thought, a good improv by Comfiore. It was very, very inventive. But it's well, first of all, theater. I mean, I grew up in a theatrical environment. My dad was a diplomat, but he was also had been as a kid a vaudeville performer, and theater was part of our life. My uncle Jackie was a musician, spent his life in music. My Aunt Grace was a dancer and a choreographer, so it was part of my upbringing. People sometimes say to me, where did you get your interest in theater and show business? It's really part of my growing up, and have loved coming here. And what's great about it is, without getting too psychoanalytical, is that you hear speeches you think you know, and then you hear them as if you're hearing them for the first time.
Right. And
you realize there's something I've missed before. I haven't seen it quite this way before. And it's a wonderful experience. Hamlet yesterday, that Arlene and I saw yesterday afternoon, was incredible because of the way it made me hear the speeches again and think more about what that play is about. And as you know, because you were an expert witness, I think, and you acted as a medical advisor to the play, I think, because I saw that on a video. So it must be true.
It's totally true.
Yeah. So you would.
Although Bob, I
be
have to tell
familiar
you,
with it.
I was apprehensive about it. Guy Pratt, the constitutional lawyer who organized and you were also an expert witness at the mock trials that used to be in the Festival Theatre. Mm-hmm. And Guy had asked me to be an expert witness and as a forensic psychiatrist as to whether Hamlet was criminally responsible for the death of Polonius. And I was apprehensive about doing it, and I said to Guy, I'm actually not a forensic psychiatrist. And he looked at me and he said, "It's not a real trial." So I learned.
Yeah.
But Bob, in the context of Stratford, the theme for this season is new beginnings. And here you are now in your 8th decade. Yep. And
thanks for reminding everyone.
In case anyone didn't know, Bob is really old. You're in your 8th decade, and new beginnings at both a personal and professional level. You've become a grandfather multiple times over after you wrote lovingly about your own grandparents in your autobiography. And you find yourself as our representative at the United Nations, a position your father held 50 years ago. Can you talk about that circularity in your personal and your professional life?
That's a wonderful way of putting it. It's been very special for me. One of the things that happened to me, and I've talked about it in my first book, which is no longer for sale because it's been remaindered so many times. It's more often than I have been remaindered, actually. is that I had my life seemed to be going on a very upward, continuingly getting better and better when I went to Oxford and and I hit the wall. I hit a wall and didn't know what to make of it, and really spent about a year and a half of time just sort of trying to figure out what the hell had happened. And in the course of that experience, I had some very helpful therapists. I had great friends. I had an opportunity. My family was very supportive. Nobody could quite figure out what had happened, and it took me a while. And I'm not sure I ever thoroughly kind of said I now understand totally. But the thing it taught me was that failure is important, which many of you will know that's been an important theme of my own life. It's been that it happens more than once. But it may sound a strange thing to say, but learning how to fail is important because you don't always succeed.
Right.
And when I managed to pick myself up and get back to doing stuff and being a more productive person in terms of my personal relationships and all the things I was then able to do, it really helped me, and in ways that I didn't fully understand. So when I was left politics involuntarily into 1995, and in politics, you're going into a career where your failures and defeats are very public. They're not private. They're things that people see every day, mistakes that you make in front of audiences that can sometimes be quite large. And I was really pleased when I started practicing law again, which I hadn't been practicing for 15 years, and kind of got into it and did it over again, went back into politics, tried to become the leader, didn't succeed at doing that, and then have made a number of changes. So for me, it's been a wonderful part of my life has been starting over again and just saying, okay, now I know how to do that now. I can start over again. And I can renew myself. And I was yesterday talking about the Stratford experience, which the Stratford experience was about why did Stratford happen, the Stratford Festival? How did it happen? It happened because the city realized that the economy around it was crumbling and they had to do something new and something different. And it was controversial and difficult. Change is hard. It's not easy. It can be humbling to do it, but it's been very important. So when Mr. Trudeau phoned me, out of the blue, after the earlier election in 2019, when he said, "I'd like you to go to New York to become our ambassador," I was delighted, but I was also very surprised, and said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "It's funny because your father asked my father to do the same job 50 years ago." And he hadn't even realized that. I mean, he knew that my father had been there, but he hadn't sort of seen it in those terms.
Well, it happened before he was born.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And that's true. That is true, actually. It's actually, he was 3 at the time, actually. But so now, and like many older people, many young people, people of all kinds, I had conflicts with my parents. And I did not go into the diplomatic service when I left university. I decided I didn't want to do that. And but I ended up still doing a lot of international stuff, even when I was in Canadian politics, provincial politics. I was always interested in it. So when Arlene and I moved to New York in August of 2020, it was emotional. And it was emotional walking into the building. And actually, you're not on Twitter, so you don't have to listen to this, but if you go onto my Twitter account, you'll see a wonderful little video that was made by my staff about 6 months after I got there, where they found old videos of my father speaking at the United Nations, and they had one of him speaking and one of me speaking about that experience. And it was really special. And I think as we go through different phases in life, we begin to understand better how we're part of this, not only the circularity of life, but also the way life changes and evolves as we go on. So I'm very conscious of my own children and grandchildren and what's coming next, and I'm also very conscious of my parents and grandparents, which is, frankly, a nice feeling to have.
Is that your dad's copy of the UN Charter that you hold aloft sometimes?
Yeah, I have it in my pocket in my suit. I pull it out, and it drives people crazy. Well, you can imagine my staff, like civil servants everywhere, when a politician, or in my case, the ambassador, gets up, they say, "What the hell is he like? What's he doing now? Like, where does this come from? This wasn't part of the script. You're supposed to read the script, ambassador. You're not supposed to." So I pulled out the charter, and it's because some other delegate had been talking about the charter, and I said, "Have you actually read the charter? Like, have you seen what's in it?" So I had a bit of a field day with them on reading the charter. So but the whole experience in New York has been quite wonderful for me, because it's allowed me to renew a connection with my own history, but it's also given me the scope to do a lot of things that have always been inside me, but I haven't really been able to fully express them.
Do you think you're more free to speak your mind than you've been previously?
No. I've always been free to speak my mind. Unfortunately, from time to time, I make mistakes. I think what makes me freer now than perhaps I was before, is that I'm less concerned about what anybody thinks about it, and particularly feel that I'm not looking for another job or running for leader again or something.
That's
where
the
you
liberating aspect.
You worry
I
about
was
the
referring
consequential
to.
parts. Yes, I do feel quite free. I think it probably, some people in Ottawa are a little nervous whenever I get up to speak, because good Lord, what's he going to say now? What's he going to tweet now? That's the other thing, that you don't see that because you're not on Twitter. But
as you've pointed out repeatedly.
Yes. Well.
So, Bob, just for the record,
it's time
initially,
you got with the program. You know?
So just for the record, initially, you denied being freer to speaking your mind, and now you've conceded that you are. Okay. I just wanted to minute it.
You're a good lawyer.
Thank you.
For a psychiatrist, you're an excellent lawyer.
So, Bob, I want to talk with you a little bit about the UN, because some people have regarded the UN institutionally with some skepticism, either in terms of its actual power to do things or in terms of some of the false sanctimony that some member nations speak at the podium. And you wrote in 2015, well before you got this job, the United Nations is really just a reflection of the world of extremes and irrationalities in which we have always lived. Navigating the many concerns and issues that confront its assembly is difficult, but stop the world I want to get off is never a sensible strategy. It was a hit Broadway show.
Yes.
But can you talk about the reality and complexity of the UN in the midst of a war with global economic implications, in the midst of a climate disaster, what it's like to be at the coalface there?
Well, Garry Kasparov, who's a former chess player, who's a strong advocate for human rights and lives in New York, has said repeatedly, and he said very recently, he said that the UN General Assembly is just dictators on parade. I mean, why would anybody want to listen to what's being said there? And my answer would be the same as the one that I frankly forgot I said as eloquently as I said in that sentence.
Well, you had an editor.
Well, yeah, and more than one, I would suspect. It would be the same, and that is the UN is the world in all its imperfections, the General Assembly, and they're all there. So you have to understand it is there. So that becomes a place and a forum where other ideas have to be presented to counteract some of the nonsense and ridiculous things that are said, and that's part of how I interpret my job. Part of my job is to speak the truth as I see it and as the government of Canada sees it, and to say that as clearly as I can. And I really do try to do that. But that's not all the UN is or what the UN does. That's the UN General Assembly. That's the part that people see. The Security Council is the UN in miniature, 15 countries, but 5 countries with a veto, the so-called permanent members. And the Russian and Chinese vetoes means the Security Council has difficulty doing anything. So that's another problem. So people will say, well, the Security Council is dysfunctional, so the UN is dysfunctional, so the world is, let's just forget about it. Let's do something else. You say, well, no, we can't really, it's there, it's an institution. But institutionally, the UN does a tremendous amount of work, which is invisible to most people. Like an iceberg, what you see is not the whole iceberg. And so there's the work that the UN does on refugees, the work that it does on countless humanitarian issues, which are exceptionally important. And even quietly, and I give credit to the Secretary General for this, while the conflict in Ukraine has been going on, while people have been criticizing the UN for not being able to do anything, he himself has been involved intensely in brokering the deal that has allowed grain to be exported from Odessa.
Right.
And it takes a diplomat of experience and skill like Antonio Guterres to do that, and it takes quiet diplomacy to do it. So I know many of you will be shocked. You'll be particularly shocked. A lot of my work I do quietly. Yeah. Then you'll say, well,
Yeah.
how do we know that? Well, you have to take my word for
Yeah,
it.
we've heard the recordings. But, Bob, I think really in some respects what you're saying is that you can't assume that question period in the House of Commons reflects all the work that the government does, right? And so what we get to see on television of the functioning of the UN is almost the equivalent of question period moments of brief speeches from podia. But in terms of what we can expect the UN to achieve, if you were to look forward 12 months, what would be your best hope about what the UN could achieve?
Well, the UN is a platform which various countries use for their own purposes, and we use it for ours. And so therefore, we have to define as a country, what is it we want the UN to do? Canada has been putting forward some very clear ideas and trying to make strong advances on them. For example, our government has a feminist foreign policy, which means that we look at the issues around gender equality as being absolutely foundational to living in the world. We look to a world which ends discrimination, which insists on people treating people fairly as critical issues. So we have tried through the institutions of the UN to advance the issues around equality and how that is dealt with. You'll be surprised to hear me say this. Stephen Harper started a very significant initiative on maternal health in Africa. His government was extremely active in promoting an end to female genital mutilation. Words that you might not expect an ambassador to pronounce on a platform, but I do so very proudly. Because these are issues that are critical to advancing the equality of women. The number of women who die in childbirth in Canada is very, very tiny in terms of the numbers of births. The number of women who die in birth in many countries in Africa is very high. The number of kids who die early on, in very early life, the number of children who die because of diseases that simply take away tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people a year is very, very high. So we need to focus our attention, our foreign policy, what we do, what the UN itself, through all of its institutional mechanisms, its aid and development mechanisms, all of that is critically important for us. One of the challenges is that thanks to COVID, in good part, and now thanks to the conflict in Ukraine and also due to climate change, the sort of the three of the many horsemen of the apocalypse that we see working through the world system, we've gone backwards on achieving what we call the Sustainable Development Goals. Right. And that is something we have to reverse. So we've got to get back to moving forward on the SDGs and doing whatever we can to advance real progress on ending conflict where we see it and dealing with both climate change and with COVID. The UN itself has been a very critical place for a number of countries in the developing world to express their anger and their frustration at the lack of progress on COVID distribution of the vaccine. I call it the challenge of me and we. We responded to COVID largely on the basis of me. To what extent are we doing stuff for us?
Right.
So citizens said, I want I want to get treated quickly. I want this quickly. I expect my government to respond. The government responds as best it can politically, and it responds to the me of domestic political opinion. The problem with that model is that we lost sight of the fact that there's a lot of we out there that are not getting attention. And this is, I think, one of the key issues. So I would hope that we would be able to make some progress on that. That's something we want to do. The Canadian government has been a very generous contributor to the we, and we need to do more. And I have to keep moving and talking with my own government about how, in order for us to get other countries to do more, we have to do more ourselves. So it's a short answer because it's shorter than your introduction.
Okay. Yeah. It's still Sunday, right?
Yeah, it's still Sunday.
Now, but Bob, in terms of how other member nations at the UN perceive Canada, how do they look to Canada as a middle power at the UN? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I've tried to develop it because I came into the movie after we lost the vote for the Security Council.
Right.
So one of the things that I did when I first did my rounds, because when you first go to the UN as a new ambassador, you go and meet either in ones and twos and fives and tens, all of your colleagues. And I went through a lot of conversation with them about what do you think about us? How do we take the vote at the Security Council? What's your assessment? And it was an interesting experience. I would say the overall response of countries was, and obviously you're the one that's asking, so they're not going to say, you're terrible, you're an idiot, please leave the room. Right. I didn't go and see the countries that I knew would say that, so I didn't see them. But the overall impression was very positive. And from the UN itself was very positive, and for reasons that I think many Canadians don't know, we're one of the top 10 donors to the United Nations.
Wow!
See, you didn't know it.
I didn't know that.
We are a significant financial contributor to the UN in all of its institutional forms. The assessed contributions for peacekeeping, the budget of the UN Secretariat, which is smaller than the budget of the Metropolitan Toronto budget, by the way, and all of the aid agencies to which we give supplemental money, we give additional money. So we give, we give over $1 billion a year in direct funding to the UN humanitarian fund, which is for humanitarian assistance, which is a significant amount. So we're seen as a major contributor, and that's important. We're seen as a country that takes the UN seriously, as a country that, if the UN says we'd like you to do more of this, we say, yeah, well, okay, we'll see what we can do. We respond positively and constructively. We're members of just about every other international organization going, Commonwealth, Francophonie, trade agreements of all kinds, North American Trade Agreement, et cetera. We're NATO, all the other organizations we're seen as part of. Objectively, we are in the second tier of countries that are donating. Compared to the top tier are the Scandinavians and the Europeans. They are the most advanced, most of the countries in Europe. Germans, for example. We don't give quite as much. So that's all very positive. On the negative side, I think the perception sometimes is that we lecture a lot. And we are sometimes vulnerable to people saying, well, are you always practicing what you preach? So that's That's how I would see it. But I think the glass is way more than half full. The argument that I have in Ottawa is we keep going with it, and we've got to make sure that our walk matches our talk.
Right. Okay, well, I want to shift a little bit away from the UN. You may recall a recession that happened to overlap considerably with your time as premier.
There's no cause and effect there, you know that.
No. These things happen, Bob. But what were the lessons you learned from that experience, and what advice would you give to people in power in the current economic times where people are constantly speculating about whether we're on the precipice of a recession?
But the first lesson I learned in being premier was you cannot ever take prosperity for granted. You can't assume prosperity. And I think the way I used to put it, and I still would put it since you asked me the question, is I came from a party, the NDP, which was really good at talking about the fact that the pie had to be divided more equally, and that you don't want to see the people who are the most powerful getting the biggest piece of pie all the time. You've got to worry about how you divide up the pie. And what I learned in office was, yes, that's true, but you got to have a pie. And if you don't have a pie, then you're not. What are you dividing up? You haven't got nothing to divide up. So, wealth creation, job creation, keeping the economy moving, keeping the economy growing, is a critical job of government. It's not that government makes it all happen on its own. It's not that the government single-handedly can do it, but that has to be a preoccupation. And my argument with my own party then, and one of the reasons why I moved on from the New Democratic Party, or moved away from the New Democratic Party, was because I felt that they didn't spend enough time thinking about that, about how that would happen, and what would be the conditions under which that could happen. And it has to be a critical component. The second one is lesson is that don't assume that people get nicer as things get tougher. Generosity, empathy are wonderful things and very vital human emotions and essential for decent life. But it's people are much tougher on each other during a recession.
Right.
And I think when there's a depression, you get more solidarity. But when there's a recession, you get more resentment. And that's makes it politically difficult and challenging. And that's why, I mean, Rae days were tough. Although no other premiers had a day named after them. You know? I mean... let alone 10 days. Right?
Well, you know, it's interesting, your comment, because as I read through most of your out-of-print books...
Oh, my God. One
of the recurring themes, and we're going to get to some of the others, is, in fact, your recognition of the importance of prosperity, not simply for the economy, but, in fact, for democracy.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the prosperity-democracy equation?
Well, I think historically, I mean, the people will challenge this, but I think historically, the democracy really takes hold in countries where eking out a living is not the only preoccupation, where there is more to go around and there's more, life becomes wealthier. I call it the Billie Holiday proposition, and that is where she famously said, "I've been rich and I've been poor, and rich is actually better." And I think there are countries that are not well off, that are relatively democratic, not very many, but the reality is that I think that as life gets better, people have more of a chance to think about other things, like freedom and cultural life and everything else. So yeah, I think that we despise prosperity at our peril, and I think certainly for politicians who say, I'm not that interested in prosperity, I'm more interested in other things. You say, well, I wish you well in your private life because you won't have much of a public life.
Right. But at the same time as you put an emphasis on prosperity, there's another force at play, which is income inequality,
Yeah.
which has increased in many countries. And what about the implications of that?
Well, it's huge, and that's I think where I mean, as you know, my second book, which you would have plowed through by now, I think, is called The Three Questions, which is based on Hillel's famous proposition that if I'm not for myself, then who is for me, and then but if I'm only for myself, then what am I? If not now, when? 3 questions.
There was actually a fourth question,
Well, there
but
is,
you left it out.
You left it out. That's right. That's right. What's for lunch or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Are you going to finish that sandwich? Is what Rabbi Hillel asked.
Exactly.
Because
The last one.
Pay was terrible
That's
for
right.
rabbis.
Inequality is an inevitable tendency in large societies. Whether it's a communist society where inequality is between the political elite and everybody else, or in capitalist societies where it's the people who have the owners and everybody else. And so the movement towards greater equality and is an expression of our common humanity. Mm-hmm. And the things that we have in common, the things that we can't just be for ourselves, we have to be for others as well. And where this, I talked about empathy and the importance of empathy in life, but also the importance of empathy in economics and in looking at the global economy, is we need to be thinking about what are the implications of leaving a whole lot of other people out of the equation, of having policies that are not inclusive. And so inclusivity and the famous phrase, of course, being at the UN, you hear it every day, not leaving anyone behind, is an important expression not only of value, but it's an important expression of interest. Because if you leave a lot of people behind, they're going to come at you at some point. So you better be aware of the implications of it.
Right.
And that, I think, is where we understand in the modern world, where if we leave generations behind, we forget about generations of young people, one kind and another, then the possibility of greater violence and greater anger and frustration at being left out becomes even greater. So yeah, I think the issue of inequality is always with us. In the latest phase of globalization, it's been even more substantive because we see this world where you not only have more millionaires, but you have more billionaires and now more trillionaires than we've ever had before. I don't resent wealthy people. We rely on them to do stuff for the world and for us. But we need to understand the social implications of letting the gap between the rich and the poor get that big, and the implications of letting the super rich be living a life that's different from everybody else. And as we know from our Shakespeare, no one's life is different from everybody else.
Right. Right. And Shakespeare's plays are really almost exclusively the history plays about royalty.
Right.
And people of extraordinary privilege, and were exposed to their foibles and weaknesses. Now, for anybody who makes the journey through your books, and I honestly have and been enriched by it. And by the way, the most recent book, which came out, I think, in 2015, What's Happened to Politics, is actually available in the lobby.
As well as 2 of David's books.
Well, the difference is I've only written 2.
We agree.
Bob's written 5.
We agreed that I would say that if you said that. Said,
Thank you, Bob.
You plug me and I'll plug you twice.
Yeah. Bob is working commission, for those of you who are wondering. But throughout the books, there are some recurring themes. And they really relate to 2 people who seem to have had an inordinate influence on your thinking. And those 2 people are Edmund Burke and George Orwell. And they appear in almost every book. They get kind of reinvented in new roles, much like your experience of watching Shakespeare plays. Can you tell us why two such different people like Edmund Burke and George Orwell have been so influential on you?
Well, there's a background to this question that you should know about. David kicked me out of the book club. I was
That's a little harsh,
I was
Bob.
expelled from a book club that David was the presiding officer of, because I made him, well, for two reasons. One is because I made him read Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, which he hated. And the second is because I'd never turned up, which I thought was irrelevant, but I said, why? Well, an irrelevant reason not to be.
It wasn't my decision. Everybody voted to kick you out of the book club.
I know. Well, they are two different guys, but in many ways there's similarities between them, which one day I'll write about when I have a free moment. Burke was a well-known British conservative, but actually he was not British, he was Irish, and he was an outsider in British society who decided, like many who come in from outside, to become as much of an insider as he possibly could in the context of British politics. He was, I guess you'd call him a liberal conservative in the sense that he believed in what then in the 18th century were liberal values, but he was somebody who believed strongly in institutions and in the importance of working through the world of institutions. And his most famous book, which is called The Reflections on the French Revolution, was really about what happens when revolutionaries take over, and what happens when tyrannies take over, and what happens to the tyranny, what happens when you have a tyranny of the majority, which you will sometimes have in populist revolutions of one kind or another. And when I started reading Burke, frankly, mainly at Oxford, I really began to see him in a different light than I had originally seen him, as just sort of this British Tory who, so what. And then I learned more about him, as you do when you actually read stuff, which is a great thing to be able to do, and found that there was something really important in two things that he believed in. One of them was that whatever you do should be based on evidence and on policies that are sound because they're based on evidence. And the second is that there is some wisdom in institutions. And finally, that there is a terrible thing that happens when populism takes over. Because the first two ideas are just thrown out the window, and liberty is thrown out the window, and human rights are thrown out the window. By the way, for those of you who are interested, there's a tremendous book on Burke by Conor Cruise O'Brien, which is called The Great Melody, which is a wonderful account of Burke's life that O'Brien wrote towards the end of his own life. So I just mentioned that to you. The second was Orwell has been I would say George Orwell has been a good friend of mine since I was about 12 or 13. And I've been reading him my whole life, as Arlene is.
You weren't the same age.
No, he's a little older. But he came at life from a different perspective. He was, his father was a drug dealer. He ran the opium trade for the British civil service in India in the 19th century. So I always say George Orwell's dad, he was a drug dealer. Did you know that? And people say, what do you mean? And I said, yeah. So his father Richard was a British civil servant, low level, who ran the opium trade in India, in a little corner of India where Orwell was actually born. He came back to England as a child, went to public school, went to prep school, went to Eton College. And then after he left Eton College, he went into the Burmese police service and became a police officer. He was also a bit of an outsider all the time, always felt himself to be an outsider because he'd come from not really scholarship boy, etc. Felt a little that way. And as somebody who became a writer, writers are often people who are always looking at things from the outside and commenting on and thinking about it. And he left the British colonial service after 5 years, and he wrote a novel about it called Burmese Days. and decided and realized that he was a writer. So he became a writer, but what he wanted to do was write about what he discovered, what he knew. So he went tramping with hop pickers in England, and he lived in the rough, as they say in England, homeless, and was a very poor personally, had no money, and wrote about that, wrote a novel about being a poor writer. And then the defining moment in his life was he went to Spain as a fighter. But he didn't join the Communist Party. He went and joined an anarchist brigade in Spain. And the book that he wrote about it, called Homage to Catalonia, is a wonderful description of what life was like in revolutionary Barcelona in 1936. This is how it starts. It was the perfect place. It was the ideal place. It was a wonderful place. And he describes it in wonderful terms. And then he went into the field, and then he came back to Barcelona after about 6 months. And he realized that there was a lot of politics going on. But it wasn't the fascists versus the communists or the socialists. It was within the left. It was between the communists and the anarchists, of which he was a member. And subsequent to that, he had a different attitude towards communism than everybody else. He saw communism as a terrible tyranny.
Right.
He saw it as the source of disinformation and misinformation. He saw it as a brutal way of thinking and acting. He was thrown in jail. While he went back to the field a second time, he had a bullet through his throat and nearly died, and was whisked out of Spain and came back to England, where everybody was saying that on the left, everybody was saying how great the Communist Party was. And he said, no, that's not like that. So for the rest of his life, he died very young. He died at the age of 47 in 1950. He wrote about tyranny and the role that writers and people of conscience have to play in a society where they see signs of tyranny, whether it's tyranny of the majority, whether it's tyranny on the left, whether it's tyranny on the right. It's terrible for human rights. It's terrible for freedom. It's terrible for the power and growth. And of course, he went on to write his 2 great books, Animal Farm in 1984, and then he died ironically, as things often are in life. He'd spent his entire life as an impoverished writer who lived, day to day, and his estate ended up making millions and millions of dollars, pounds, whatever, from these 2 great books, which are now, universally published all over the world. So yeah, I mean, both of those people have been very important in my thinking.
And both about the dangers of tyranny.
Yes, yeah, that's the theme throughout. And also, in more practical terms, what both Burke and Orwell wrote about was about what's wrong with empire. Because Burke was Irish.
Right.
And he had a different perspective on the British Empire than others. That's why he wrote his famous stuff about the U.S., because he saw the American Revolutionary War from a different perspective than the British Tories did. And that's why he did this famous attempt at impeaching the East India Company's leader, Warren Hastings, in the trial of Warren Hastings, which is sort of the end of his life he devoted to trying to bring down the East India Company, which he saw as a terrible, plundering
By the way,
mistake.
I want to let people in the audience know, there will be a spot quiz on the lives of Orwell and Burke.
Yeah.
A lot of biographical
Well, you asked for it.
detail.
You asked me this
Sure.
question. You asked
I
the
opened
question.
that door.
You opened the door,
Yeah.
and I could see you glazing over. I could see David was saying, "Oh, I've done it again." I've got him going on this theme.
Yeah. Well, but
My wife is at the back going like that.
Actually, she left a few minutes ago, Bob. But, Bob, this actually does provide a perfect segue into the next area I wanted to talk with you about, because you are...
Sleep disorders?
You are once again living in the United States, as you did as the barefoot, hard-scrabble child of a diplomat in Washington.
Right.
And as Canadians, we are morbidly fascinated by the extremes of American life. And in your book, What's Happened to Politics, which I point out was published the year before Trump was elected, you cited what you called the decline of deference, the rise of celebrity, the shift to infotainment, and the explosion in the frequency and range of media coverage as contributors to the idea of politics as a circus. Now, that was in 2015, which many of us consider the pre-circus years. So if in another grab for readership and sales, you were to put out a second edition of What's Happened to Politics, would it differ? And how would it differ?
No, it wouldn't differ. It would build on it because the circus, that's only one ring of the three-ring circus. I mean, the circus is continuing and it's not going to stop quickly. Absolutely. I mean, I benefited from having read and listened to a number of people providing analysis of what's been going on politically for a long time in the U.S. and in Canada and elsewhere. And I think we're all subject to these same trends, and we're all trying to cope with them and understand what they do to our ability to live together in a way that's civil and caring and thoughtful, which is how we should all been trying to live our lives. We don't always live up to the standard, but that should be how we would do it. So no, I wouldn't change it. And once one area where I do hold my tongue a little bit is in commenting on U.S. stuff, because, well, first of all, the government said, tone it down, Bob. We've got a trade relationship to build here. We don't go over the top here. But it is an amazing experience living in the United States at the current time, and in particular, just living in the media and public environment in which we live. It's really challenging. And I think it's one of the things that as a Canadian, you realize when you spend a lot of time in the U.S. is we think we understand this country, and we think we're sort of the same as they are, but actually we don't necessarily understand it completely, and we're not really the same.
Well, let's explore that a little. What do you see as the differences now that you've been on your second tour of duty living in the United States?
Yeah, I think the big difference is that it's not a difference of all the things you mentioned, which I won't read out again, but in terms of what I said in the book, is true of Canada and impacts our politics, but it's even more true in the United States. And I think with the additional factor, which is hugely important, which is not different in kind, but different in dimension. Two things. One is the race and the role of racial politics. And secondly is the role of money and the impact that money has on the society. And obviously in our own society, money plays an important role. But we've found, for example, in politics, we found a way, not 100%, but we have found ways of actually controlling the amount of money that gets into the political system. And so you don't have to be filthy rich to run for senator, or you don't have to raise millions and billions of dollars to run for president, and run for prime minister. And I think it's important to remember that. And we have our own racial issues or issues of ethnic identity. And particularly the Indigenous issue is more important in Canada than it is perceived to be in the United States, although it is significant there too. But those two things, I think, have really make you more aware. For example, a lot of things which we might not think as being racial issues are. Let's give you one example. Healthcare. I think one of the real sources of resistance to universal health care in the United States is the perception that the word poor is often a synonym for black. And so people will say, "Well, I don't want to. I don't want to give my health money to somebody who's going to abuse the system." You'll hear that in Canada, but not very much. I mean, really, people don't. We've got to the point where health really is seen as a common good. I hope. I hope we never lose sight of that fact. But in the United States, it's not. It's the world of what's public and what's private is slightly different between our two countries, and when it comes to things like healthcare and social services.
You know, you talked at the very beginning of this interview about, lessons learned and the need to fail, that all of us have failed at something.
Would you mind,
Well, I'm not including myself,
No,
Bob, but most of the people in this room.
I just never heard you talk about that very much,
Yeah. So last month in the New York Times, they devoted a page of the op-ed section to the banner title, "What I Got Wrong."
Right.
And it was an amazing piece, a set of pieces to read by their leading op-ed columnists, including Paul Krugman, who's won the Nobel Prize for Economics, writing about what he got wrong.
Right.
And now, acknowledging that economists have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, the reality that if he can acknowledge what he got wrong, it has a permissive effect for the rest of us. So I'm wondering if you can look back on your long career in public life and think about what are some of the things that maybe in retrospect you got wrong, but just a reminder that many people here have tickets for a matinee. So
I know, it's 11:34.
We're a little constrained by time. But since you opened the kind of failings or things you get wrong, what strikes you now looking back?
Well, agreeing to do this interview would be one, I guess. You said it was going to be just a lot of fun, and it would be no.
Okay, I lied.
No. That's okay. Yeah, it's right. My bad. Well, as you've said, it's a long list. I think that in my early life, and I think these are traits that you never totally get over. I think I was too judgmental and too quick to too quick to find fault, and too quick to be self-righteous. And I found that, and I'm very aware of there's some people in the audience who will say, "Yeah, so what's changed?" But I do think that now I'm not as quick to judge, and much more driven to find out an explanation. And I remember talking to my brother about this a while back, and we were both saying that when things go wrong and something doesn't happen that should have worked out differently, how often do we ask ourselves the question, what could I have done differently? Not what did the other guy do wrong, what were the mistakes that others made, but you ask yourself the question, what mistakes have I made? So that's, I think, something that I've gotten wrong. I think the other big thing is the difference between listening and talking. You and I are both talkers. No, you're right. When you're, but when you're listening, it's more like you're waiting to, what are you going to say next, right? Or the difference between stopping yourself from interrupting and listening is quite substantial. So and finally, I think the big lesson that I had to learn, and this is part of what I did learn from my first experience with depression and anxiety, was that perfection is our enemy. Right. And I really, really discovered that I had in my own life, I had I had a tendency to look for perfection. And if you look saying I can't submit this essay or I can't finish this thing because it's imperfect, then you're never going to get it. You're never going to be able to get it done. So you've got to be able how to learn with the fact that life is not perfect. I think that philosophically or politically, if you like, the trend to be more accepting of compromise and to say that it's better to get something out of this than to get nothing out of this, and all that, I think, is what contributed to my movement away from the New Democrats to the Liberal Party, where ultimately I felt that I was more accepted and more at home for better or for worse. Part of that's getting older. I think learning in politics that you've got to avoid flipping way from over to one side of an argument way over to another side has been really important for me. And so trying to find not middle ground, because sometimes the right compromise is not the middle ground. Sometimes it's somewhere else that involves giving and taking is critically important, and it's what I've learned how to do better as I've gotten older.
That's fair.
Thank you.
No trouble. Bob,
is there a charge for this, or is it just one of those?
Well, you raise an interesting issue.
Is this covered by OHIP, this interview?
In 1996, you wrote, "No doubt there is a Freudian explanation for my relationship with the Liberal Party." And I don't know if you have come up with that explanation or if you need it from me.
No, I think that I started out politically as a liberal, as this big L liberal, when I was in university, and I was a supporter of Mr. Trudeau's, Pierre Trudeau, and as a 18, 20-year-old, 21-year-old, whatever. And then when I moved to the left, if you like, as a student, and left the Liberal Party and joined the New Democrats when I came back to Canada after being in England. The reason I'm not a Tory is, I think, in large part because of my experience in the UK. I find it really hard to take sort of the British model of Toryism. It's something that I would ever look at and say that's something I could do. Right. I just said no. It's not how I think at all. Learned a lot of humor in England, though. I mean, it's a lot of
the best.
Very, very good. But I do think that both in when I came back to the Liberal Party when I joined in 2006, when I ran for leadership, which was a bit of chutzpah when you think about it. Not having been a member of a party for a long, long time, having been in another party and leading that other party, and then to go back and think you could actually lead a federal party.
But in fairness, you were living in Canada all that time.
Yes, yeah, that was different. I did have that advantage, but no. But so I mean, there are sort of psychological explanations for a lot of things, but I find now that. I mean, I guess the thing that I feel more than anything now, particularly that I'm in New York and doing this job, I feel more at home than I've felt in some situations in some places. I remember when I first went into the legislature in provincial politics, it was tough. I found it really difficult. And I think a lot of other people did too, initially in my early days as leader of the NDP in Ontario. I have no, leaving a party is not quite like getting a divorce. I don't know what getting a divorce is like, and barring anything that comes out of this meeting, I don't think that's going to happen. I have nothing but respect and affection for my friends in the Democratic Party. I don't, and they may not feel the same way about me. I just feel that I've moved into a different space than perhaps they would be comfortable in, but I feel very much at ease and proud of my association with the New Democratic Party. But it was important. It was necessary for me to be fully myself to move on from that.
Well, look, this doesn't sound very Freudian to me. This sounds like the inner peace that comes with wisdom and experience.
Yeah, but not all experience gives rise to wisdom.
Fair.
You know?
Fair. I mean, we could get into the Freudian explanation, but I'm afraid our hour is up. Now, we did receive a bunch of questions.
There's no couch up here. There's no couch here anyway.
I do want to acknowledge the questions that have been submitted by all of you. Mr. Rae, would you recommend the book Canada's Voice by Adam, looks like Chapnick?
Yeah, Adam Chapnick.
About John W. Holmes as an early history of Canada in external affairs?
Absolutely. It's a great book. John Holmes was born in London, a wonderful man. He was a contemporary of my father's and a very, very close friend of my parents, and had a big impact on me as a young man. And as a boy, he was a wonderful friend. And Adam Chapnick's book about John is a superb book, both about John as an individual and about his view and his contribution to the UN. And he was briefly, because he was very young at the time, he was Canada's permanent representative at the UN in the late 1940s. But it's an excellent book. It's a very good book.
So that's a thumbs up from Bob on that book. Your memoir, From Protest to Power, remains on my bookshelf. Doesn't say whether it's read.
No,
it just says it's in the to-read section from 1996. I recall you feeling depressed when in a library. All those books, and I can never read them. What are any good books that you read, and what do you recommend? See, Bob, you're back in a book club.
I'll be kicked out of this one as well. Well, in addition to Burke and Orwell, which by the way, I do recommend reading. I think, in honor of Salman Rushdie, I think everybody should read Salman. The book that I would recommend most of Salman's is Midnight's Children, which is the book that won the Booker Prize in 1981. And it's about India and Pakistan. It's about India, Pakistanis, and Indians in the UK. It's an extraordinary novel. It's like all of his writing. It's really quite exciting and really good to read. I did talk about how there was so much to read and so little to do, but it's so difficult to read them all. In fact, you can't read them all, right? So you have to pick and choose and pick what you like and pick who you feel most comfortable with. I have found that the book that influenced me a lot as a young boy or young man was James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. It got me into reading Joyce, which was a wonderful experience. And when I was at Oxford, I had the opportunity to listen for 1 year to Richard Ellman lecture on Joyce, and which was a great lot of fun because he lectured on Ulysses, which is not an easy read, but it's worth trying and worth having sort of as a companion book. I love reading mystery novels. So I get a lot of pleasure out of that. And I'm reading novels by a guy called, Alan First, who writes about France in the Second World War novels, mystery novels. Very good.
There's several tips there. How optimistic are you?
David Goldblum's 2 books. How I learned to, whatever they're called. I can't remember what kind of...
the title's all blurb.
One's called Please Help Me, I think, or Please Buy This Book, I think is what it's called.
Take one as you leave.
Yeah, that's right.
It's called. Bob, this is a question that's germane to you, having worked before your current position in a law firm that specializes in Indigenous law. How optimistic are you that we, Canada, will make real progress on the truth and reconciliation front?
Extremely optimistic. Because I think if we're honest with ourselves, we look in the mirror and have to recognize that growing up, we knew almost nothing about this. When I say we, I mean this is largely a non-Indigenous audience. I think it's fair to say. And that is a reality. But on the other hand, you have to consider how far we have come and how much awareness has been increased and how much determination is being expressed by our many political leaders about what more needs to be done. I think we have to understand that, like everything else, the journey begins with, as Murray Sinclair said, the expression, the truth will set you free, is true, but the reality is first it will really piss you off. And the more we learn about the truth, the more shocked we are when we think about it. And then we begin to realize how long the journey is. But I think it's important for us to recognize that already there's been enormous progress. In our lifetime, collectively here in this room, looking at the hair color and the shininess of some lights on heads and so on, the reality is that there were no Indigenous people in universities and in law schools and professional schools. There weren't any. And now we have just earlier this week an Indigenous woman being named to the Supreme Court of Canada to universal acclaim. Same thing is true of people look at the graduation rates from high school and say it's terrible because the rates are not as high as they are for non-Indigenous people. But then you say, okay, what were they 20 years ago and 30 years ago? And that's how we should see things, is are we making progress? And the answer is yes, we are, but it's going to require a continued commitment to getting to understanding, embracing Indigenous languages and cultures as part of our cultures and languages, and understanding that this is who we are. And I am optimistic about it.
Great. Now, regarding Myanmar, what can we expect of and from the UN and the international system, as well as regional actors like China and ASEAN?
Well, it's very tough. The Myanmar is now ruled by, as it was for many decades, a military dictatorship, which is brutal, terribly brutal, but it is a highly contested dictatorship. The country's in a civil war at the moment. And conflict is a terrible thing, and the loss of life is a terrible thing. But the fact is that people are prepared to fight for their freedom and prepared to fight for what they believe in. And that changes the dynamic, because for the years of repression between 1960 and 2010, there was conflict, but it was a highly repressed conflict. Now it's a conflict that's absolutely out in the open. And so we're dealing with a dictatorship that's increasingly desperate and having a harder and harder time providing for reasonable order for their country. The reason that I mention this is because the one thing that China, which is its neighbor and the most significant regional party in this dispute, the reason that China is so important is because the one thing China wants more than anything else is order. And if what is happening under the army doesn't create order, then the Chinese start to say to themselves, well, what are we going to do? Because this is not leading to stability. So I'm not I refuse to be pessimistic. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I just think we have to recognize that the situation there is going to be very dynamic and it's going to change dramatically. I have to say that I think the ASEAN partners have been disappointing in their ability to intervene and get to a better place. But hopefully pressures will grow that will allow that to happen.
Okay. And what will it take for Canada to increase its overall development assistance level to that of other rich nations?
Well, we're behind, as I said, the gold standard, which is that of many of the Scandinavian countries and a few others. I think it's really, we allowed ourselves to fall far back in the pack, not just under previous conservative, or it's not a liberal conservative issue. It's an issue of Canadians generally not being sufficiently aware of the importance of keeping up our contributions. And I think one of the things that Canadians are going to have to get used to is that global conflict, instability, all of the things that are happening in the world will require us to become more engaged, which is a euphemism for saying it's going to cost us more on defense, it's going to cost us more on aid, we're going to have to be prepared to pay more, which means we're going to have to be prepared to pay more. And the way we pay is through taxes. So it's the challenge we face as Canadians. Are we interested or prepared to do more? And I think governments are going to be looking at these situations and saying, what do we do? It's not about being generous only. It's not about doing things for others. It's about doing things for ourselves. Because let's take COVID as an example.
Right.
The reality is that COVID or pandemics don't disappear from the world because we've all gotten a vaccine. That's not how it works. As long as there are people around in the world who are not vaccinated and who are subject to this disease, then we're not solving the problem. So that's what makes finding global solutions not just an act of empathy or generosity for other people. It's about doing what we need to do collectively to get to a better place. And that's really where solidarity is not about a negation of self-interest. It's about
it's
more
enlightened self-interest.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's more about doing the stuff that works. You should go into this stuff. You find the words quickly. You're very good. I find myself getting.
Well, they're written on these cards for me.
Well, that's right.
Now, we're going to switch to the domestic scene, Bob. And it's not me, it's the person who scribbled this, I am increasingly concerned about the polarization in Canadian politics. Is there any hope we can get to healthy, constructive debate, or are we doomed to the automatic inertia of right versus left?
Well, the book that's for sale out there is what's happened to politics is partly about this theme, about polarization. Right. In fact, if you look at Canada, we're quite remarkable because as opposed to most countries, we have created institutions which allow for more dialogue. I don't think it's only about politics. I think it's about what other institutions, like Stratford, for example, and other places, this conversation we're having, which more or less has been pretty civil and not too dramatically kind of. I didn't start out by saying, David, you're an idiot. I mean, it's
sounds like you're going to end up saying.
I might get there in the end, but I think it's hard work to fight back against those who would insist that being personal and being insulting and trying to drive a stake through institutional dialogue and so on. But I also think it's connected to something else, which is the polarization is not just in politics. The polarization is in a lot of other ways too. And one of the things that we have to understand is that marginalization of people contributes to polarization. In other words, as people feel excluded from the good things, from life as it can be lived, they feel that there's something wrong with these places, or they feel that those institutions are them. They're the other. They're not us. They're not me. So I'm not included in that institution. So therefore, I can feel free to go and attack it. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, is the importance of finding ways in our lives to include others and to be aware of other people and to understand that the things that we have in common are really important. So sometimes that takes an almost superhuman effort to try to get behind the the behavior or the activities of people with whom we completely disagree and trying to figure out, why do they think that? What is it in their lives that makes them feel that that's true? And so whether it's people who are opposed to vaccination or people who are opposed to allowing more immigrants to come into the country, whatever it may be, you got to say to yourself, well, why do they think that? And how can I engage with that person? Not being naive, sometimes you're not going to make much progress, but it's really important to try to find out the ways in which we can do that.
Which is a pretty good operational description of what empathy is ultimately about. Now, you know, Bob, we are being live streamed, so some of the questions are coming from people not in the room. This one, interestingly, it's not so much a question as an observation, comes from the International Space Station. One of the cosmonauts wrote in that they found your golf ball. And they're really encouraging you to take a mulligan. Now, we're rapidly approaching the end of this interview.
I think we are, actually.
Yeah. I think you'll agree with me that of all the challenging interviews you've been through in your career, this has been the most recent. And so on behalf of everybody here, and I know Julie Miles is going to close off the event, just at a personal level, I want to thank you, Bob, for agreeing to be here and to do this, and to thank all of you for being such an attentive and engaged audience. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I have a question. Is book club the same as fight club? So what happens in book club stays in book club? Because if that's the case, then both of you are kicked out. You're done. I'm happy to share with everyone here that after our event here, Mr. Rae and Mr. Goldbloom are going to be available to sign books in our beautiful cafe. And the theater store kiosk is also open if you want to purchase a book, just saying. Mr. Goldbloom returns to us in a few weeks for the final two events in his series, where he will interview Mervyn Mehta from the Royal Conservatory of Music on September 10th and retired Supreme Court Justice Rosalie Abella on September 11th. And tickets are selling fast. And again, lucky for you, the box office is open too, so you can go get those tickets. I would ask that as our guests leave the stage, if everyone could just stay in their seats so that we can get them over to the book signing, that'd be terrific. And thank you again, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.